If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. Hi there. Today, I want us to have a look at burnout, at overwork, these kinds of things. And I want to look at those because they're a clear indication that we're doing busy wrong. And I don't like it when we do busy wrong. I want us to do busy right. I'm going to talk about how to combat this overwork, this burnout, this challenged work environment that we face. If you want to turn down the burnout, turn down the overwork, here's the best way to do it. It really boils down to one idea, and that is, how do we decline work assignments? How do we say no? A lot of what I'm going to say is based on Cal Newport's thinking about a better work assignment system. Cal published an email not too long ago where he talked about these challenges, overwork, burnout. And then he talked about the ideal work system that could be put in place that would help each of us get on top of this problem. So he describes what the problem is. And we're going to bring a lot of that forward here, but we're also going to talk about what's required from you in order for you to be able to say, no, I don't accept that new work, and to do that without getting fired, because that's the problem. We're going to go there today. So I'll talk about Cal stuff, and then we'll stop talking about Cal stuff, and I'll start telling you what I think. And I'm going to use the word burnout, not because I want to, but because it's shorthand. It's shorthand for too much work to do, and the overall challenges that too much work to do can cause for us. I mean, even if you don't feel burned out, there's probably a pretty good chance that you're trying to do too much work at once. And if nothing else, it's making you inefficient. And we'll get that out and deal with that as well. The cause of burnout is in the big picture. It's the work culture. It's an amount of work problem. And we all know this. We know we're burned out because we feel like we do a lot of work and we feel like it's too much. When we think about that, we don't know how to solve it. And we're going to talk about that today because I think a lot of it is unnecessary. A lot of it is waste. And you know me, I'm all about eliminating waste. When we think about the work culture, there's a couple of things going on. One piece is that we're engaged in knowledge work. Now, I argue that we don't really have a clear sense of the notion of quality in knowledge work. Quality in knowledge work is very difficult to measure. And for us, that means it's very difficult to have confidence that what we're doing is good work or sufficient work or valuable enough for us to continue to get paid, to not get fired. This is a challenge on a couple of different fronts. One challenge is a clear sense about the quality of our work. If there were a clear standard about the quality of our work, then I think we would all work probably less. We would work to that standard of quality and we'd be fine. But that's really difficult to do in knowledge work because of the lack of this measurability. Historically speaking, we're much better at controlling the amount of physical work we do. I think the reason is because we visibly get tired, and there's more acceptance of physical limitations than there is of mental limitations on how much work we can do. In short, in the culture, it's one thing to get tired because you've been digging ditches for 8 hours straight. It's another thing to get tired because you've been sitting in a desk chair for 8 hours straight. I think people struggle with that mental picture and we give it lip service, but it's really hard for us to think through. Now, the fact that we're struggling with this, it's hard to think through, is not surprising. The amount of work that we need to do in order to get paid a living wage has always been a problem. We went through a similar argument 120 years ago in the physical labor space. And people were working these insane hours, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, even more, 14, 16 hours a day. They were constantly working in order to get paid. And in that case, it took unions and legislation to resolve the issue. And that's with physical labor that we could easily see. But at the time, apparently, we just didn't care and had to get other forces involved in order to make managements behave themselves. So my argument is that the knowledge work culture is going to have to go through it just like we had to go through it with the physical work culture. So it's not that big a deal. We just need to think about it clearly. At that time, we started regulating physical work. We set a number, and it's 40 hours a week as the quote standard unquote. But there's nothing magical about the 40-hour a week number. It was a compromise. The reason that I want to bring this up is because I don't think 8 hours a day, 5 days a week is the correct limit for knowledge work. And what I mean by that is that we have evidence that if you're doing intense knowledge work, 8 hours is too much to expect. Most people that do intense knowledge work do 2 2-hour shifts a day. And the rest of the time, they're doing less mentally taxing work. Now, it's possible that over time, we could train ourselves to have greater mental stamina. But for now, we just need to recognize that. As an example from my life, I used to be a computer programmer. And then when I managed programmers for a little while, I was a player coach and still did some programming. So I wasn't programming every day, but there were full days that I would program. And what's funny about that is my wife could tell immediately when I walked in the door whether or not I had been coding all day long. And I asked her about it, and she said that I just looked mentally drained, absent after doing that level of work for that long. And I wasn't actually doing it 8 solid hours. It's challenging once you get beyond a couple of hour stretches to be able to do that well. So I don't think 40 hours a week is a magic number, but we're not going to change that 40-hour a week standard anytime soon, probably. And I'll say, as knowledge workers, if anything, we're probably working more than 40 hours a week. Now, some of that is a salary versus hourly question. Some of it is our own work culture around trying to get promotions and bonuses and these ideas. Some of it's work culture around management's doing a poor job of performance evaluation in the knowledge work world. For these reasons, employees always feel like they're kind of on the back foot and always having to deal with either a real or an imagined risk of losing their jobs. And that's stressful. And there's a few things we can do about that from the management perspective, from the work culture perspective, but that's another episode. For now, let's just hang with this 40-hour a week thing and let's see what we can do with it. At least most employers will give lip service to 40 hours a week. So the fundamental problem here is the amount of work. And that means two things. One, if we can only do 4 hours a day of hardcore knowledge work, I think that's okay because A, we'll be ahead of everybody else who's probably not doing that much hardcore knowledge work. And on the other hand, there's still plenty of shallow work that we can fill up the rest of our days with. But the tendency is still to overwork. It's still to be or feel required to put in too much effort and to do too many things. So why is it overwhelmed? Why is it so burdensome? I argue, along with Cal, I argue that it's due to the number of projects we're engaged with at any one time. And there are kind of two parts to that. So the first is Cal's idea. So he talked about this notion of overhead tax and how it's related to each project that we're involved in. Each individual project has at least a minimum amount of overhead tax. And that overhead tax is made up of project status, keeping track of the records of the project, and just mentally knowing that this project is in flight. Okay. So that tax relates to each initiative that we have to work on, each bigger kind of project level thing that we're working on. And so the first part of the challenge of too many projects at one time is the cumulative overhead based on the total number of projects in flight. As an example, say it takes an hour a week just to keep the pilot light lit on a project, whatever that means. Well, if you have 10 projects in flight at one time, that's 10 hours a week of people popping in to ask you what's going on, maybe attending a meeting, maybe writing it into your weekly status report, whatever that is, but it's a non-zero amount of time. So if you have 10 projects going on at any one time, you have 10 hours of that. And if you have 5 projects going on at any one time, you have 5 hours of that. Well, that's almost half a day a week you can get back just by having fewer projects in flight at one time. The other primary effect of having too many projects going on at the same time is that we're required to switch between them more often. We're required to switch between projects more often when there's more of them. And switching is always a waste of attention. And I've said that many times before on this podcast. So you take those two things together and add them up, this is a huge waste. And Cal's argument, and I'm sort of putting words in his mouth here, is that you'd be much better off working 50 hours a week with 2 25-hour-a-week tasks than with 10 5-hour-a-week tasks. And what we've talked about, what we know from our own experience, that makes perfect sense. So I'm going to say it's the number of projects. And what does that mean? Well, there's some rumblings when I'm recording this, there's some discussion of some proposed legislation somewhere to shorten the standard work week from 40 hours to 32 hours. I presume this would apply to white collar salaried workers that are knowledge workers. And what I'll say is it doesn't matter if laws like that get passed, because currently there's a 40-hour-a-week law and nobody works 40 hours a week in the white collar world. Everybody works more than that. And a lot of that more than 40 hours a week is this overhead work that we're talking about here. And I'll give you an example. Okay. And this is not to beat up on your people. Everybody does this. The example is, what's your company's vacation policy? Well, you get 3 weeks a year, 4 weeks a year, whatever that is. Here's my question. Do they have somebody that's going to do your work for you while you're on vacation so that you don't have to worry about it? Probably not. Most companies don't have that. So you're probably, if you take a week off, going to have a week's worth of stuff on the corner of your desk when you get back from vacation. And what that means to me is the expectation is the expectation. And we just need to really recognize, I say this to say, don't expect somebody else to come swooping in and solve this problem for you. You're going to have to solve it yourself. So I agree with Cal, and I think we've demonstrated it's not just the number of hours, but it's the number of hours sort of modified by the number of projects that make up those hours. So what do we do? Well, we'll talk about what Cal recommends, and then I'll add to that, and we'll talk about recommendations when we're trying to deal with this large number of projects. kind of back to don't engage in fairy tales. The number of projects is not going to go down. They're not going to stop coming. I talk to people and they say, well, I have a lot to deal with right now. And next month or next quarter or next year, it's going to decrease. No, it's not. I've not seen that happen. It hasn't happened in my own life. I've never gone to somebody 6 months later and said, hey, you thought you were going to be less busy about now. How did that go? And they go, oh, yeah, I have a lot less to do. No, it's constant. And so we need, again, we need to just deal with it. It's not going to fix itself. So in my mind, we need to deal with the at one time part of the number of projects. So work that's not started is not invasive. It's work in flight that causes the problem. So we want to try to take on fewer things at once. And this is also Cal's recommendation. And there's lots of good thinking around this in the productivity literature. And even in the physical production literature, that if we take smaller bites, if we run smaller batches, we make better progress. If we're doing fewer things, then we close out each one faster on average. And there's nothing surprising about that if we look at the rest of our lives. I think the problem is that we just don't know how to get to fewer projects at once. And we're confronted by the workplace culture of, I'll say, yes-ism. So rather than saying no, we'll lie and say yes. And part of this is because we know we don't have the tools to say no effectively. That if we try to say no, we won't be successful, and we're afraid of trying to say no because we're not confident that we'll be successful saying no. That's how we're going to address this. We're going to work on our ability to say no to more work at the same time. We're going to work on a way to say, hey, 5 projects is the most that I can handle at any one time, and have data to support that and have it make sense to people who are in authority over you. The Cal's underlying solution to this is to make work visible. And you say, okay, here's all the things I'm working on. And then we use that information to make an argument that I'm not going to accept another thing. I don't have bandwidth to bring in another thing. And again, this has to do with making work visible. You got to be able to point to it. And what I mean by that is you can't guess at this. We'll get to it in a minute. Now, the extension of Cal's suggestion is that we put up a system and we let other people assign work into the system so that we don't even have to be bothered by the requests to do work. Does that make some sense? That people go to your system and they say, hey, would you put this in your list? And then we sometime at some point do a planning session and we say, yes, no, maybe I'll do it. I won't do it. Here's the deal. And then get back to whoever the requester was. Well, a system like that's really unlikely to happen. And he admits this, that it's unlikely, but I think it's even less likely than he thinks it is. And again, I'm making this point because nobody's going to swoop in and save you. Your government's not going to save you. The organization's not going to save you. Your organization is probably not going to come down next quarter with some work transparency initiative when all of a sudden your customers are managing their own work assignments to you. Now, I say this because most managements don't spend much time working on the individual employee's productivity or even thinking about the individual employee's productivity from a tactical perspective. They just don't spend a lot of time thinking about it. They'll talk about team productivity. They'll talk about team information management, but they shy away when it comes to individual tactical performance ideas. They'll shy away from coming in and saying, hey, you know what? Your productivity needs to improve. And here's the tool set that we want to put in your hands for that. Use this tool set. This will make you more productive. They shy away from that. My guess is that that would probably be categorized by the employee as micromanagement. And micromanagement is weird. It's the witch hunt word in the current workplace. Micromanagement does not have to be proven, it just has to be asserted. And then managements and managers start backing up and going, oh, I didn't mean that. And, oh, okay, well, we'll do it differently. And that's probably what would happen if your company started saying, oh, here, manage your calendar this way. Oh, here's the amount of time to spend per email. And my evidence here is that there are people in call center places that are getting managed at this level, and they're nonstop fussing and complaining about it. You got to let me do my work my way. Your system doesn't work for me, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, it may be true or false. I'm not sure that anybody has enough data to say system X doesn't work, but it ain't going to get by and be implemented. It's just not worth the overhead. So even if your manager is very worried about your productivity, I don't think they have the lift to help you solve this problem. They don't have the oomph in the organization. And in truth, they might not have the confidence to do it either, because most managers don't have their own productivity under control. So Cal's recommendations to make work visible, to have a list out there that people can see. And he talks about that visibility being at the public level, which I argue with. And then he talks about managing that work in what's called a Kanban system. And I'll define what that is towards the end. Now, I say this because I think Kanban is good. I think it's nice, but I think that work visibility is the primary thing that we need to deal with. And it's because work visibility will help us improve our chances of being able to say no to work. So the first thing is manage your work. Now, when I say manage your work, most people think about, I've got X amount of work. I need to manage what's already there. How do I task switch? How do I minimize? How am I efficient? But we all know that management also includes the overall scope of your efforts. So not only do you need to manage the stuff that's on your list, but you also need to manage how stuff gets on your list. And you need to try to exert some control over that. So now we're talking about accepting or declining new work requests. When we're offered a new work request, we tend to presume that we must say yes, and there's good reasons to do that. But there is one bad reason, and that bad reason is we can't provide reasons for saying no. We know our arguments are weak, so we don't know how to set up data so that we can try to say no, so that we can support no and explain no. So when we try to say no, we end up saying, well, I can't do that. I can't get that done. And that makes us sound like we're not good at our jobs. And so we're already in kind of a bad place when we start having this discussion. And so I argue that we need a better solution to that. But because of that, when we get new work requests, we tend to say yes, but we mean no. And what we're actually saying is, I'll get to it as soon as I can. And that's a terrible commitment, whether it's vocalized or just understood, because nobody knows what it means. And when we're non-specific like that, we set ourselves up for a huge challenge because we're not being clear. So we've got to take the responsibility for our own ability to accept or decline. It's just self-defense. Otherwise, you're going to get all this work, and then you're going to be in a position where you're going to get burned out. And guess what? Nobody really cares. I care. You care. Your company, they got to give it lip service. But I'd say let's get proactive here, and let's build ourselves a system, and let's start having this discussion. The system needs to produce answers that are based on productivity every time, never on our level of busy. It should always be if I do this, then it's going to hurt the other projects that I'm doing. But in order to say that, we need to be very clear on the current list of our tasks, all of them, all at once. And depending on your relationship with your manager, you can walk them through all this logic. But even if we have to say yes, the list is essential. Having the list is essential. Because when we say yes, we also need to say when. And that's the second part of kind of controlling this. If I have to say yes, then can I say yes, but next quarter? Okay. Now, in our heads, when we estimate work, we think about total hours and we translate that to days if we need to. And we say something like, okay, that'll take me a day. Now, we've got to stop doing that because our customers hear it'll be ready tomorrow. That's what they hear. That's what they want to hear. So that's what they hear. So we've got to start talking about delivery dates rather than talking about effort. But in order to translate 8 hours of work into a delivery date, then we have to factor in other work and other committed delivery dates. And we can't do that without a managed up-to-date list. So whether we say yes or whether we're going to try to say no, we've got to know how much work is on our plate to be able to give an answer about this new work. We got to have a list. Great, got it, got to have a list. So the remainder of this episode is going to be, how do we go about getting a list together? What's the tactics here? Well, the first thing I'll say is a stack of papers won't work. It's not sufficient. We're not confident with our stack of papers because what we're trying to say is, oh, your new thing is less important than everything in this stack. And we don't know that. We can't argue that because we don't clearly know what's in the stack. So we've got to be able to walk through what's going on, particularly your boss. So, hey, look at how much of a mess my desk is. I can't take anything else on. It's not going to be a worthy argument here. Another thing about this list, we got to be able to pull it out and show it to somebody at the drop of a hat, in particular our boss. Now, for other reasons, and I'll get into this, we should be going to our boss on a regular basis and saying, okay, here's my list, here's the status of these things, and being proactive about having that meeting. And I think too many people are reactive about that kind of meeting. I think a lot of people just want to keep their head down and do their work until their boss wants to come see them about it. And that means that there's no reason to have a good tool. Where if we're being proactive and we're creating this data and carrying it to our boss, then we're motivated to have a good tool for it. If you don't have a good list, you're going to lose the discussion. You look like you're making it up on the fly. You look like you're making excuses. You look like you haven't planned for it. So it's hard for people to have confidence in that decision. So get a list and get this evidence together. So we need a well-managed, organized, probably prioritized list of what we're working on right now. And I'll say we can create that with Attention Compass. That's one of the purposes of the Attention Compass system, is to have a list that we actually work from. Thus, it's always up to date, and we can use it for this conversation. And we implement a whole system in order to keep this list up to date. So we need to talk about what this list is and what it looks like. Cal talks about it's unlikely that somebody else is going to build this system for us. And I agree for the reasons that we talked about. So we need to create the system for ourselves, but it's not just busy work. It helps us in our own thinking as well. So how do we go about building this list? So again, it all goes back to, you got to know what the present work is. You got to make work visible, even if it's just visible to yourself, because it's got to be visible to you before it can be visible to anybody else. So once we have this list that we can show to people, we can start talking about the real world. Here's the list. You can go talk to your boss about it. And then your boss will have enough information, enough ammunition to back you up. Okay, so that's the most basic requirement is you have to have and to manage, i.e., keep up to date, a complete picture of what you're doing. Now, this is a big challenge in the modern workplace because stuff's coming at you from all kind of directions, from your teammates, from other departments, from your boss, from your boss's boss. All these different things are flooding in, and that's why Cal wants us to move to a single input channel for this work. But when people send you work, they're interested in results and deadlines. They're not interested in how busy you are, how you manage your work. They're very short-term minded, particularly when it comes to other people. And this is a huge challenge. Doing it mentally won't work. Doing it mentally is a backwards memory thing, and our memory is not good for it. I've not seen a good after the fact tracking system where you go back and put time in at the end of the day. I've never seen a good one there. And although all that's true, you still got to be able to whip out your list at a moment's notice. You can't just trot this list off the top of your head. Okay. It doesn't look like you planned. I'll also say it can't just be a list, but it's also got to be a list that's validated by your boss. Because when you start saying no to stuff, your boss is going to have to back you up. And I mentioned this a minute ago. And it's easier for bosses to back up decisions they've been consistently involved in. It's easier for your boss to say, yeah, Larry and I talk about his backlog every week, and he knows exactly what he's on. So if he says he can't get to it for the rest of this month, I agree with him, and we'll have to figure out another way to get your work done. So we have to build a system. We have to build a process for having this list. So the requirements for the list, at any time you can bring it out, your boss has looked at it, you know it backwards and forwards, and you know the status of each thing, and you can show it to other people. So the system is about building a list like this. Oh, I don't need a system, I just need a list. Well, you have to have a system, because if you don't have a system to put this list together, then you don't have a system for saying no to stuff. And then you're going to wind up saying yes a lot more often than you think you will. A lot of people have said to me, well, I just learned to say no. I'll just start saying no. And I come back to them in 6 months and I go, how's it doing? Did you learn to say no? And they haven't learned to say no. So we need a system, we need a process to develop this list to help us say no. Author named James Clear, and he writes about habits. He says, you don't rise to the level of your intentions. You fall to the level of your system. And that means we default to what we've designed. So if you want to get better at saying no, build a system, build a process, build a formal process for saying no. And part of that is this list. And then you can say to the boss, hey, look, here's the priorities that we developed. Now, in order for that to be true and up to date, you need to be having a conversation consistently. Now, you're not necessarily doing this for permission, you're doing it for backup. And you're showing this list and you're talking about this list so that your boss is confident that you're on top of your stuff. And then your boss can back you up. That's the attention compass. One of the primary products of the attention compass is this list that you can use in this way. Now, the attention compass is, in fact, a system that helps you manage your attention. So, managing being the operative word, because that's the same thing that you want to do when you're sitting down with your boss, is together you want to manage your task list. That's active, that's intentional, that's exerting control over it. And I'll say most people in the workplace are victimized by their list because they're not able to exert control over it. Now, how does the attention compass go about building this list? Well, first, I'll say the correct kind of list for this purpose is a backlog. A backlog provides all these benefits. With a backlog, we can look at it and prioritize it fairly quickly because it's in rough priority order all the time. A backlog is something we can easily add new things to and take old things off of it. We do that consistently. We learn how. We can take a snapshot of a backlog or maybe even show it to somebody on our phone as evidence of where we are and what we're doing. And so when somebody wants to talk about our list and our work and whether something new fits on, we can do all this stuff. And in addition to that, when we're at our desk and we're actually doing our work and we're deciding what's next, we go to that same list. So it's not two lists in two places. It's not one for your boss and one for you. It's one list in one place that fulfills all of these different functions and is automatically kept up to date because you're actually using it. It's important that we be able to do this in real time. If you've ever said to your boss, hey, boss, I see this new work assignment that you want me to do. I need a couple of days, so I'm going to get my stuff together and understand where I am right now, and then we'll talk about this new work. Well, that's a tough ask for your boss. Okay, so we need something that's up to date all the time that we can pull out and we can go, okay, here's the list. Okay, and that doesn't have to be this huge management challenge because with the process that we implement, all this stuff is up to date. So we can react quickly and take initiative. A lot of people don't understand what a backlog is, and I talk about this in other places, so I'll just briefly hit it here. A backlog is a very long list that's consistently maintained, and it's probably kept in priority order. And by maintained, I mean up to date with all of the work we've accepted and probably most of the work we've declined. Now, managing this is not a trivial thing to do. It's not easy. Most tools are not adequate to the task. Most tools are built to manage a different kind of list. And so that's why I built out Attention Compass, is to put you in control of a backlog, and a backlog is the best tool for the job. When I teach Attention Compass, part of the process is how to turn a list into a backlog. The difference is a list is a one-off kind of ad hoc, hey, I'm going to the grocery store, I need a list kind of solution. And we in the workplace need much more process and a much more robust solution. And so that's part of the whole process. So that's teaching you how to do a backlog and what a backlog is and what it looks like. Now, when we go back to Cal's recommendation, what he recommended was actually a Kanban system. And I said I'd talk about Kanban. So Kanban is an extension of a backlog. In other words, every Kanban is based on a backlog, but not every backlog is a Kanban. Okay. So I do want to make 2 points. You don't have to get straight to a Kanban in order to be useful. And before you can have a Kanban, you got to have the backlog. So that means that we can create the backlog. And then if we still need the extra support, then we can go forward to Kanban. And I'll talk about what that looks like. Cal talked about the fact that the primary thing driving burnout is not the overall quantity of work. It's the number of different projects and the overhead we're paying for each one that leads us to burnout. So when we start thinking about the number of different projects, and this is how a backlog turns into a Kanban. So backlog is largely one really long list, and it's ordered by something. And in most cases can be quickly ordered by several different data points, right? So sometimes it's by due date, sometimes it's by last updated date, and sometimes it's by title, like that. But what a Kanban adds is it provides buckets for this long list. And typically the buckets are either progress-based or priority-based. So in addition to being on this long list, a task is also in one and only one Kanban bucket at the same time. Okay, so the Kanban buckets are not really separate lists. They're sub-lists, if you will. So the buckets are typically progress-based or priority-based. And if we look at progress-based Kanban, it has buckets like the first bucket is I'm working on it. And the next bucket behind that is it's ready for me to work on it. It's done the pre-work. We've done the pre-work on this. And the third bucket behind that is I know about it, but I'm not ready to work on it, or it's not ready for me to work on. And then we can go backwards as far as we want with these different status buckets. Another way to do a Kanban system would be priority based. There's a bucket with the number one priorities. There's a bucket number two priorities, number three priorities, with the idea that my priorities and my current work line up. And if I need to go get some other things in either kind of system, then I can go to these other buckets and get them. And that's a feature of Kanban. A much more important feature of a Kanban relative to a simple backlog is what's called work in progress limits. And work in progress limits is one of the reasons you have these different buckets. So you have the buckets, but with work in progress limits, each bucket has a limit on how much it can hold, expressed in number of items. As an example, let's say it's a real simple backlog and it's things I'm doing now and things I'm not doing. And the things I'm doing right now has a work in progress limit of 5. Only 5 things can be in the bucket. So what happens is only when something comes out of the things I'm doing right now bucket can we pull something else in. That's our rule. That's our process. That's our law. That's the standard. And if we have to complete one of these 5 things before we pull something else in, then we're enforcing our work in progress limit. And that would address exactly what Cal's trying to deal with. Now, something's got to go before something else can come in is not the least common rule in the history of rules. Your refrigerator probably works that way, for example. Your favorite rock band t-shirt collection probably works that way. You know, oh, I've got 5 of this kind of t-shirt. One of them's got to go away before I can get a new one, right? If you're a musician, the number of your musical instruments probably obeys a similar rule. Okay. So that's a work in progress limit kind of a system. And so it makes perfect sense. It's not hard to understand. Now, if we implement these buckets to get from a backlog to a Kanban, it will directly solve the problem of having too many projects in flight at the same time because you've got a bucket with a work in progress limit on it. It's a great thing if you can push it that far. An important takeaway here, though, is before you can do that, you got to have a backlog set up and running, because the buckets are not going to do you any good if there's not a list for the buckets to operate. Now, you may have heard another term, so let me just explain this nuance. A Kanban is a pull system. And a pull system means we're in control of the amount of work we do. We have a rule. Now, the interesting part is we're controlling the supply of effort versus the demand for effort. And that means that we're severely limiting the total overhead tax because we're limiting the number of projects that are in progress at any one point, right? Work in progress limits. And that directly addresses the problem that both Cal and I think we have in the workplace. Just as another example, a very simple Kanban has a single bucket, or 2 if you prefer to think about it that way. And one bucket is the things I'm thinking about, and another bucket is everything else. So you decide how many things you can think about at one time. And that number is quite small, low single digits. And then everything else has got to be in the everything else bucket. So when I'm done thinking about something in the thinking about it now bucket, I pull it out and I deliver it. I deliver my thoughts, put it somewhere else. But then I'm able to go back to the everything else list and pull something new in. So we've talked about a lot of things. So where have we gone? What are we doing? Okay. But we've done a lot of work here together today. We've done a lot of thinking. We're thinking about burnout, about overwork, and there's a couple of problems. But according to Cal, and I agree with him, the primary factor in burnout is the number of things we're trying to do at any one time. Yes, the total amount of work hours in a week contributes, but it's really the number of things I'm trying to do at once. So the best way to deal with it is to control the number of things we're doing at once. Our typical workplace, and I'll say our typical tool set, doesn't support us doing that. The typical workplace MO is to say yes to everything. And then once you've said yes, you manage the effort on it. So we wind up saying yes and meaning no, or at least saying yes and meaning not yet. Well, that just means that we're taking on this overhead of multiple things in flight at the same time. Because as soon as I take on something from somebody else, the status is my responsibility. It's not their responsibility anymore. So at any time they can pop up and go, what's the status on the project? And I have to be able to give them a status. And that's the cause of this overhead. And if the status doesn't change from time to time, they're going to get mad at me because I said I'd do it. So that's where this burnout comes from, this overhead. And we've talked about that at some length. So I want you to understand that so that you can begin to act on it. So Cal's recommendation is make work visible, and then you can talk about where your work is. And oh, by the way, he says build a system where your customers add work to your list on their initiative. So they're adding to, and if we put this in Kanban terms, they're adding it to the somebody wants it bucket. But then I, and only I, control bringing it into the I'm working on it bucket. And that's fine. But we talked about the fact that we're a long way from those kinds of systems being the norm in work culture. In the meantime, practically speaking, we got to figure out a better way to say no. And that has to do with managing work in progress. And I don't just mean be aware of its status, but be careful about deciding whether or not to bring it in. Because once it gets in the queue, it stays in the queue. Now, we'll talk about managing once it's in the queue. That second idea of management comes into play, which is which one am I working on now and how far are they all along? If we're going to take the necessary step of declining new work requests, we might as well assume that we're going to have the conversation with our boss. Anybody with the organizational power to ask you to do something has the organizational power to complain to your boss. Even teammates have this power. So you're going to have to defend this to your boss at some point. And we talked about the most effective way to do that is to be able to show a clear picture of what you're doing and a clear picture of when you could do the next thing. And related to all this, the negative implications of forcing this new thing into your list. All that means is you got to have a list. And we talked about what the list looks like and how you can create one. It's a self-management challenge to have this list, but it's not insurmountable. People say, well, I don't have time to create and keep a list. Well, I'd argue that you don't have time to not keep a list. And in this sense, in our own work, we've got to get over this short-term efficiency mentality. And we've got to understand that efficiency and productivity requires planning and it requires a system. And if that requires us to do some system implementation work, then so be it. Now, if your intent is to be able to say no, the pressures are such that you need a system because otherwise you're going to fall back to yes. We talked about this. James Clear said, we don't rise to the level of our intentions. We fall to the level of our systems, our procedures. So we've got to have that in place, because otherwise, in front of the boss in the heat of battle, we're going to forget to say no. I spent some time explaining why attention compass is a useful and straightforward example of a system, a set of procedures that produces the kind of list that you need to have in order to have this kind of conversation with people in authority over you. We've seen the way to attack burnout and overwork is to have a system that supports you saying no. And I think attention compass is that system. As usual, love for you to reach out to me and let's have a conversation. If you think some of this is off base, let me know that. If you're interested in hearing more about this, let me know that as well. If nothing else, just say, hey, I'm listening to the podcast, and we'll start a conversation. I'm pretty easy to find. You can find me on LinkedIn. And also you can find me at larry@dobusyright.com. I will say, if you take the LinkedIn option, then just put I'm a podcast listener in the connection request, so I'll be able to sort you out from all the bad actors out there. So giving you some information. So get out there and get your system going, and I'll help if you like. And do busy right. I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do busy right.